Hi, my name is Elisa, and I'll be doing my disease report on Kuru, which some may also know as the laughing disease. So Kuru first occurred at its highest peak during the time of the 1950s and went on until the 1960s amongst a tribal group known as the Four, which were found in the highlands of Papua New Guinea. This disease arose as a result of the practice of ritualistic cannibalism amongst the tribe after they consumed the brains of deceased family members in honor of them. The government did try to make obvious efforts by discouraging the practice of cannibalism, which did decline the amount of people reported with Kuru, however did not completely stop the epidemic. So what is Kuru? Kuru is an extremely rare yet fatal disease that affects the nervous system and reached its highest prevalence during the 1950s and 60s, as I mentioned in the slide before. They believe that the name for the disease, or the word Kuru, came from the Four word for shiver, which is one of the symptoms you'd experience if you developed the disease Kuru. It was actually the first neurodegenerative disease resulting from an infectious agent and did lead to a whole different class of diseases that they're still trying to study today because they don't fully understand what causes these diseases and how they affect the brain. So they do know that Kuru belongs to a class of infectious diseases called TSCs, or transmissible spongiform encephalopathies. And they call them prion diseases as well because they believe that the causative agents are believed to be prions. So the hallmark of TSC disease is misshapen protein molecules that clump together and accumulate in the brain tissue. And this, scientists believe that these misshapen prion proteins have the ability to change shape and also cause other proteins of the same type to change shape as well. So these prion diseases belong to a family of rare progressive neurodegenerative disorders that affect both humans and animals, and are usually distinguished by longer incubation periods, spongiform changes associated with neuronal loss, and the inability to induce inflammatory response. So these prions are mostly found in the brain, which is the reason they lead to brain damage and is usually rapid and always fatal. However, the function of normal prion proteins isn't fully understood, so that's what they're trying to research as well. So transmissible spongiform encephalopathy, or TSCs, are all agents that do differ dramatically from species to species in incubation times and neuropathology and things like that, depending on whether it's Creutzfeldt-Jacobs disease, fatal familial insomnia, mad cow disease, or scrapie, which are all examples of TSCs. They do more closely, mad cow disease most closely resembles Kuru in symptoms, and scrapie most closely resembles Kuru in terms of how they affect the prions in the brain. So right here I have two pictures, one of a healthy protein and one of one affected with scrapie, because I was actually unable to find anything on Kuru because of how little research has been done on it. But essentially these are alpha helix structures, and once they are infected, they become beta sheet conformations, and the change occurs when the gene gets mutated. So first, there's a spontaneous generation of the infectious PRP protein, which in this case is PRP scrapie. And then there's, the conversion of, as I mentioned, the generation and the conversion to this. And once the mutation has formed, there's an inoculation of new mutated proteins until they have multiplied. So here you have pictures of infected brains. If you look here, this is obviously the normal one. And then the two in the middle, if you look closely, you can see like sponge-like holes found throughout it. And the picture farthest to the right is just the entire brain. If you look closely enough, you can see differences between the normal one and the one infected with Kuru. But if you look closely, you can find vacuolizations in the neuronal cytoplasm and dendrites, which do give it this spongy appearance, I guess you could call it. And there is very little pathological change in the white matter of the brain. However, if you look at the gray matter of the brain, there is more intense spongiosis and PRP deposition. So then you look at the stages of Kuru, and usually there's treatments and whatnot, so some may not have to experience the more terminal stages, but for Kuru, there's no cure or treatment. So an individual infected with Kuru will experience all of these stages until they die. You have the prodromal symptoms, which are just things like headaches and joint pains, which you experience and you could experience on a day-to-day basis. So it's not easy to diagnose Kuru based on those symptoms, but once you reach the ambulant stage, which actually means the inability to walk, or the ability to walk, you show signs of the difficulty walking, tremors and muscle jerks, dysarthria, and things like that. And then you move on to the sedentary stage, where an infected individual suffers from cerebellar ataxia and becomes incapable of walking without support and experiences severe tremors. They can also show signs of severe emotional instability and sporadic laughter, which is where the name, the laughing disease, comes from. And actually what's ataxia is a disorder that occurs when the cerebellum becomes inflamed and damaged. And the cerebellum is the area of the brain responsible for controlling gait and muscle coordination. So the term ataxia itself refers to the lack of fine control and voluntary movement. Then you reach the recumbent stage, and recumbent actually means lying down. So you can infer that at this stage, the infected individual's existing symptoms have progressed and have reached their most severe stage, and the person can essentially no longer do anything on their own, including swallowing, which is usually the main cause of death for people with Kuru because of severe malnutrition. However, other causes of death are infection from developing chronic ulcerated wounds. And again, as I mentioned, there's no recovery to be documented in a patient with ataxia. So symptoms were kind of covered in the slide before, but it actually could take months, up to 6 to 12 months, for anyone to show symptoms, or 50 plus years have also been recorded, but because of its long incubation period. So an individual could have the infectious agent in their body but not actually show any symptoms for years after. So it infects things like poor coordination problems that become extremely severe in the recumbent stage, difficulty walking, headaches, difficulty or even inability to swallow, tremors and muscle jerks, arm and leg pain, slurred speech, behavioral changes, weak and incapable to grasp objects, and even in some cases, uncontrollable laughter or crying. So it's actually kind of strange that it's known as the laughing disease, because it's not always a symptom, but I think because it's the most outrageous, it's very well known. So Kuru, as I mentioned before, was restricted to the four people in New Guinea and its neighboring communities. It was first investigated in the 1950s. However, the 4 oral tribal history puts the first case back closer to the 1920s, but when it was present in epidemic proportion from the 1950s to 60s, it killed about 1,000 people in the first 5 years. So they've continued monitoring the process of this epidemic since its first discovery, and since discouraging or since banning ritualistic cannibalism, they have fallen to only 2 deaths reported in the last decade, and they're still trying to follow it because of the long incubation period. It's possible for incidents to still pop up. So, at-risk population and transmission. I put these together because, I mean, if you look at them, and from what I've said before, they kind of go hand in hand. But New Guinea were one of the only tribes that really practice ritualistic cannibalism that heavily, and so realistically they're the only ones that can contract it. But I suppose technically if anyone eats an infected brain, they can also get Kuru. So I suggest not to eat infected brains. But the 4 did have over 80% of the recorded cases of Kuru. Women and children were mainly infected only because they were the primary participants of these rites, of these rituals, not rites, of these rituals. There's been no evidence for vertical transmission of Kuru. However, I don't know if these women lived long enough or could even give birth due to how weak they were. But you can, like I said, contract the disease from eating an infected brain. And it's also likely that you can contract it from coming in contact with open wounds or sores of someone infected with it, but that's not entirely proven. And the diagnosis. So realistically, the neurological exam and the test didn't happen because many times it was self-diagnosed after the onset of the more severe symptoms. And also taking into consideration the people that got Kuru, it was unlikely that they would even go to the doctor if that was an option. But the 4 tribe actually didn't think that it was a disease. They believed that it was some sort of sorcery and that they got it from doing something bad throughout their lifetime, which ironically inclined them to practice the rituals more, hoping that by eating the brains of their elders, they would gain knowledge of something more valuable to learn how to rid themselves of this curse that they called it. But I guess some ways to diagnose it are neurological exams, which include checking their medical history, checking a neurological function and how well their brain works, checking blood tests, not necessarily to see if they had Kuru, but to make sure so they could cross off any other options, or they would just take tests. But they weren't entirely accurate, so again, they were kind of useless. And to emphasize again, prevention and treatment. There's no treatment that can control or cure Kuru, or actually any other TSE, if that. But there is a prevention, which is discouraging the practice of cannibalism. So these are the websites I used. If you have any questions, I'd love to clarify them. Thanks for watching. Bye.